And we are live. Yay. Thank you everyone who is joining us today. I am Gabacha, your Desert Life host with the Desert Institute, and I am super honored and super excited to be able to facilitate today's conversation. So I hope you are too. Before we begin, we always like to start with an acknowledgement. So let's just take a moment to respectfully acknowledge the indigenous peoples who have stewarded the land we are on for time immemorial. And let's honor their past, let's honor their present and their future. So for the Joshua Tree National Park area, we want to acknowledge the Mojave, the Cahuilla, the Serrano, and the Chemehuevi peoples. For Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I'm tuning in from, I want to acknowledge the Jicarilla Apache and the Pueblo people. And then I will hand it off to Danny for your acknowledgement.
In Southwest Colorado, many thanks to the Ute people who stewarded this land before us.
Thank you. Sophia?
I'm here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and I would like to acknowledge the Shoshone tribe and the Nez Perce tribe who had this land before us.
Thank you. And Sirena?
I'm in Tucson, Arizona, ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham and Pasquayaki.
Thank you. And thank you everyone who's joining in today. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, and also if you can let us know the indigenous peoples of the land you're on, we'd love to hear about that on the chat. So please don't be shy to share. I want to start by thanking the Desert Institute, which, if you're not familiar with us, we are the educational branch of the Joshua Tree National Park Association, dedicated to bringing cultural, artistic, and science programs normally to the field within Joshua Tree National Park and its surrounding public lands. But as you can see, we've also adapted to the current landscape, and so we're also doing virtual events. Desert Live has been a series of, I think, 9 or 8 events that conclude tonight. So it's very special night, especially for me. I feel like this is like closing a chapter of my life. So thank you for everyone who's been part of this. I want to continue with some rules for our time together. So please be nice in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And it's specifically for this conversation. We want you to be a part of it, and we want to hear your thoughts and opinions. They're super valuable and they're part of this. So please share, but also be nice to each other. If you can use the little questions, the ask a question button on the screen to ask your questions for the panelists, we'll appreciate that because it makes it easier for us to keep track of the things that we want to bring up. So I'll appreciate that. In case we get disconnected, please wait a little bit and refresh your browsers. We'll be doing the troubleshooting on our end, and we'll try to get back on as soon as possible. Also, donate, share our post, follow us, support in any way you can. If you've already made a donation, thank you so much. If you cannot make a donation right now, you can share with your friends, and that helps us have a wider reach and continue to support programming like this, and it being able to provide some remuneration to our guests. So thanks for that. We're also working on facilitating presentation materials. So stay tuned. You might receive something in your email in the near future with a little bit follow-up notes and fun things like that. Okay, so today we have as our guests Dani Reyes Acosta, who's an outdoor media strategist and athlete, Sirena Rana, who's an author, public speaker, and trail designer, and Sophia Schwartz, who's a free ski athlete and physical therapy tech. And it was very important for this conversation to bring people that have a diverse background and diverse experiences in the outdoors so that we could really dive in to the topic, which is why we leave no trace. So as our public lands and outdoor spaces gain increasing popularity, I think it's our responsibility as good guests and visitors to make sure that these spaces can be shared and enjoyed in the future as much as they are now. So that was kind of the inspiration into bringing this together. And so I want to segue into talking a little bit about the Leave No Trace Center, because it's the big organization that whose mission is providing education, skills, and research to help people care for the outdoors. So they are the big stewards that kind of provide us with a lot of tools so that we can articulate the need for caring for the land, as well as to recreate responsibly ourselves. So with that being said, I want to now go into the 7 principles. And some people might say there are 8 principles, but let's focus on what the Leave No Trace Center website is telling us, that it's like we have 7 official principles. And I'm just gonna do a quick mention of these, so we're all on the same page. I don't want to assume that everybody is familiar with it. And actually, we have a poll going that says, how familiar are you with Leave No Trace? And I think we got a couple of people who can recite the principles on command, some people that have heard about them, but they don't know them by heart, and then people that have heard of it once or twice. So thanks for chiming into that poll. So the first principle is planning ahead and prepare. And that helps because you can accomplish your trip goal safely and also minimizing the damage to the land when you're well prepared. And this includes things like knowing the weather, bringing enough water, having sunscreen, bug spray, and that kind of thing. And having a map, knowing where you're going, how to get there, is it open, is it closed, that kind of thing. Principle 2 is travel and camp on durable surfaces. So what are durable surfaces? These are the surfaces that are not going to get damaged with your presence, with your weight, with your things on them, right? So rock, sand, you definitely want to avoid. You want to avoid vegetation and other soils that may be vulnerable. Principle 3, dispose of waste properly. So obviously, some parks and some outdoor spaces have waste disposal stations, which sometimes I've seen waste disposal stations in places where I'm like, I'm not leaving my trash here. Like, whose job is it to come all the way here in the middle of the river to pick this up? So I would say pack it in, pack it out is the best practice that you can do for yourself and also for the rangers and the staffs whose job is to go get the trash and to help the parks maintain a cleaner environment. Principle number 4 is leave what you find. So from vegetation to wildlife to archaeological items that you might encounter while you're out in the field, while you're out on a trail, just leave them there so more people can enjoy them. So I know it's sometimes you're walking and you see this beautiful rock and it's like, oh, it's no harm in taking a rock, right? But somebody else can have that same moment if you leave it. So it's kind of being nice to whomever is coming next. Principle 5 is minimizing campfire impact. So knowing exactly how to make a safe campfire, number 1, and also not overdoing it. If there's already a ring for it, there's no need for you to go create a more beautiful one somewhere else. And also just avoiding campfires. I would just say minimize campfire impact. It's just avoid campfires as much as because you don't really need them. It's more of a luxury when you're out there. Principle number 6, respect wildlife. So, keep your distance. Don't feed them human food. That causes all sorts of trouble, including disease. Not just they're adapting to human food, but some wildlife is very sensitive to it. Don't touch them. Don't try to mess with them. Even if they seem like they're super accustomed to humans, you never know how they're going to respond. So it's better to keep yourself safe and keep them safe. And then last but not least, principle 7, be considerate of other visitors. And this is kind of my favorite principle because it kind of brings it all together. Like when you practice everything, you're already being considerate of others. And it's also something beautiful to take into your life, to wherever you go, to be considerate of everybody else that is there and it's going to enjoy that space, whether it's outside or inside. So those are the 7 principles. Danny, I know you've brought up the 8th principle a couple of times in conversations. So do you want to just briefly explain what that is? Or well, yes. And this is up for debate. This is not an official principle. Let's just say that.
Sure. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but I think the 8th principle has to do with geotagging and how we leave impact based on our digital footprint.
Okay, so
Sirena, do you have
tagging? Is this the tagging responsibly? This is okay.
Tag responsibly.
Okay. Yes, and this there is actually a really good article, and I might
uniforms yet.
There's a good article about the movement of the 8th principle, and we'll get a little more into that in a few, but there's an article about it at the Leave No Trace Center website, lnt.org. I'll post it at the end, and you'll be able to go and see what the center has to say about that. And they're not completely absorbing that as a principle of its own, and rather saying it's part of other principles. So we'll get there, but I want to open the panel by asking everybody here, why do you leave no trace? And I'm just going to ask the panelists, but also people in the audience, if you leave no trace, why do you do it? So if you want to start sharing, Sophia, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Kavacha. I have been thinking about this question a lot recently because I think leave no trace is something that I never officially learned until a few years ago. It was sort of, in my mountain upbringing, kind of talked about just how to be outdoors. And I hadn't known the 7 principles until recently and seen them more outlined and defined until I moved into more of a mentor volunteer role. And I think the reason I leave no trace is because I know that history is longer than any one of us, and that to keep these places pristine and yet have more people in the outdoors takes more work. And I think leaving no trace takes effort, right? It's nice to just, take that rock or walk off trail as a shortcut. And I think putting in the effort to make sure that everyone gets to enjoy it means that more people can also enjoy it as well.
Thank you. Danny?
Sure. I think building off of what Sophia had said, a big reason why I leave no trace is very much tied to being able to share these spaces and experiences with people that are there now or will be there in a week or 2 or decades from now. So a big part of it is, I think, trying to think of those who will come in the future. And another part is because, ultimately, if I also want to go back to a place as well, even for myself, right? I think part of it is selfless, but another part of it is selfish, if I'm being very open. We also want to be able to have these experiences with other people, but on our own too. And I think as people that work in this industry, that are athletes and recreationists, the example that we set and the way that we, and even just as everyday people, right? The examples that we set and the framework that we leave behind is either gives permission or sets a bar for what others will live by. And I leave no trace because I want to enjoy something in the same way that I found it, or maybe better.
Thank you, Sirena.
When I think of why I leave no trace, it makes me think of when I was starting out as a river guide in the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River. And when we had our training, we had indigenous representatives from the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe come speak to us. And they said something that really made an impression on me. And that was, treat it like your grandmother's house. And I think that that just embodies so many different things about leave no trace. You know, the respect, the, you know, obviously like the cleanliness, you wouldn't go like throw garbage in your grandma's living room. But just the deep respect and stewardship of the land, I think also comes with that. And that is always in the back of my mind, you know, respecting the land, respecting nature, and leaving it, like Danny said, how I found it or even better.
Thank you for sharing that. I was also thinking about this question mostly all day today, and it kind of brought me back to, like, my simple answer is I leave no trace because I care. But then I thought, but why do I care? And it really brought me back to my dad, because my dad was a hunter and a fisherman. He doesn't really do much of that anymore, but whenever we would go out, he always was picking up trash that he found and said, this is bad for the environment. It doesn't decompose. It's not biodegradable. Or, you know, he would say things like, well, even if it's biodegradable, it doesn't mean that you can throw it here. There's a place for waste. And so, yeah, so I think it really goes back to, yeah, I care because my dad taught me to care. And then, but why he was able to teach me to care is because he was a person that I admired that showed this to me. So, you know, so like having someone that you look up to, and it kind of goes back to what Danny was saying, right? It's like you're leading by example. So what you do makes a precedent for the people that are coming after you. And so, yeah, I think that's why I leave no trace. Yes, thank you everyone for sharing that. So maybe we can dive into some more specific questions, I guess, around it. And do you all would like to share how, and I think a little bit you've already done, Sophia, but how you learn about leave no trace, how you learn to leave no trace? You'll start. We'll just go there. Sophia, Danny, Sirena.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think that up until this panel, I hadn't really contemplated my outdoor education much. I think that I am white. I grew up in Telluride, Colorado, and moved to many other ski resorts, and that the outdoors has been just a big part of my upbringing, and I've always really felt kind of like an insider, and wouldn't even known that that was even a thing until probably like 10 years ago when started to like reflect more on my outdoor experience. And so I remember going on a Grand Canyon trip, which is fun to hear Sirena talk about that as well. And my friends were using the acronym LNT. And I was like, what? Like, what is that? Like, I don't know what you're saying. And they were like, leave no trace. And I was like, oh yeah, I like know that. But I think that I've stepped into more of like a volunteer role with a program here in Jackson called Coombs Outdoors and with She Jumps. And it was in kind of those like education mentor roles, or where I started to learn about the actual like 7 principles and sort of defining and outlining, and then also like educating others about them as well. But I think my parents were really the people who kind of instilled in me the idea of trying to respect a place and not leave your footprint on it in any capacity.
I think it's really interesting, Sophia, to hear you talk about how it was sort of this kind of ideology instilled into just your being, your said, right? Your form of being, because of how you were brought up. And if I may segue, I imagine that was a good segue, right? You're good. Okay. That, same kind of thing, I think, for me. As a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't really have any formal outdoor education in the sense of going through any kind of programming, other than the Girl Scouts. And I did go to Girl Scout camp every summer. Well, not every summer, but many summers before I was 12. And my family would often take trips before I was, again, 12, 13, out to the mountains, or, once or twice a year. And I have some distinct memories of, wanting to model or, patterning behavior off of maybe my Girl Scout leaders or my mother or father, picking things up and taking trash with us. But, at no point in time do I remember any sort of curriculum being passed off to me, right? There was no lesson plan where we sat down and learned the principles by any means. And probably, again, the Girl Scouts was the closest thing that maybe instilled some of those general ideas in a formal fashion. And so, like you, Sophie, I think probably my formal acquisition of the terms, the principles and knowledge around what is LNT has to do with moving into more formal leadership or mentorship roles. And I think it was actually in 2008 I volunteered at Yosemite Facelift, which is a big annual cleanup of Yosemite Valley, and it's a really, really wonderful event. This year, I have to give them a plug. They're doing a totally online event, which is going to be cool. And they're not gathering people in Yosemite. They're doing like cleanup in your own backyard, which I think is just such a cool way to help people clean their backyards. But yeah, it was actually, I think, going to Facelift where I was like, okay, I need to think about like what is LNT, because the LNT people were there, and I think actually someone had handed me a placard of LNT principles for climbers. And that's when I realized that LNT can look different for different groups of people and recreationists. And that's how I learned about LNT.
So my story is quite a bit different from Danny and Sophia. I grew up the child of two immigrants. My dad's from India and my mom's from Italy. And we did go to national parks and things like that when I was younger, but we never like went hiking. We never put on backpacks and went hiking and things like that. I was outdoors from time to time, but never really, we weren't really outdoorsies. Like we never went camping. We never, we would do like some kind of car touring around the parks. But, my dad comes from India, and he thought when he came to this country, he thought that, people sleeping outside in tents was, kind of a ridiculous thing because that's what they do in the village. So, he just didn't quite understand it. And so, our experiences growing up were, like I said, car touring and things like that. And, he always had a great appreciation for nature. And so that's where I got my love of nature from. But, even when I got into hiking later on, and that's how I learned about LNT, was in 2007, I decided I was going to hike the 800-mile Arizona National Scenic Trail. And that's what led me to research LNT. And my dad helped me out a lot with my crew. He was like my support crew for quite a bit of it. I section hiked it. And so he was actually really kind of bummed that he had gotten to this age and didn't know about hiking, even though he enjoyed the outdoors so much. And so it was in the process of researching how to hike the Arizona Trail and how to do long distance hiking that I came across the Leave No Trace principles. And then, like I mentioned before, I ended up being the one to teach those on Grand Canyon river trips. And a lot of our river trip passengers were people that didn't spend a lot of time outside. I worked on the motor trips, which a lot of times has folks that are a little less acquainted with the outdoors. And so we had a lot of beginners, a lot of people where it was their very first big outdoor trip. And so, teaching people about Leave No Trace right at the beginning in the orientation and getting that to be like really important part of their whole trip was how I ended up teaching Leave No Trace.
Very, very cool to hear all the different ways. I think for me, it's quite similar to Danny and Sophia, where I already said, like, my dad taught me to take care of the outdoors because we spent time there, and that's what you did because it was the right thing to do. But when I started volunteering for the Desert Institute 4 years ago, I think that's the first time that I heard about the Leave No Trace Center and the 7 principles, like broken down like that. And I just remember thinking how cool that there's an organization that's literally dedicated to spreading the word about this. Because, you know, obviously my dad's not going to get to everyone, not on his own, but, you know, or like what you can do as a person. It actually, yes, what you do as a person has a lot of impact, obviously, but to know that there is a body of people that organizes around making sure that more and more of us can have access to this way of thinking and this way of looking at recreation is super important. So I just remember being super, super impressed and just loving it and super nerdy. I went on the website and did there's like an online training for like the 7 principles. Yes, you did that too. So I just did that and got my certificate and everything. You know, you just get it right away. I hope that's still up because this was literally 4 years ago before their new website. So I don't know how it's working these days, but it was just really cool to see those things organized in that way. And also for me, I understand, like, I'm a nerdy person. I like to read and I like to learn those things, but also going into their website and realizing that they actually provide all sorts of different kinds of tools for children, for adults, for people interested in volunteering. So I obviously naturally sign up to volunteer, and it's pretty easy to sign up to volunteer, and you can do pretty much anything as long as it's within the guidelines that they provide you to do. And, you know, ever since I kind of just became a steward in that way, where like these are great tools for me to approach people and tell them that there's a place where they can go learn more, you know, beyond a conversation that I may have on the trail. So yeah, that's how I came across that. So I guess a segue into, because we call the 7 principles we call them outdoor ethics, right? And I wanted to kind of discuss the difference between outdoor ethics and outdoor rules and how those intersect and how those get, I guess, communicated and why that's important to acknowledge and think about. So, Sophia?
Yeah, I'll jump in, and if anyone else wants to kind of play off or jump in as well. I think that I like the idea of ethics because I think, one, rules are just really hard because they're always changing, right? What is quote unquote correct in one environment is not correct in another environment. And I think that I like the idea of ethics because it sets like an intention to like recognize that like what you do like makes a difference. And I think it's Jane Goodall that has the quote of like, anything you do makes a difference. You have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. But I think that there's like this idea too that like sometimes you just don't know that your actions have consequences in a different way, and being open to like listening and learning makes a huge difference, right? Like I think that even like walking off trail or, you know, picking a flower and knowing that it'll grow back, or, you know, I loved Danny's you know, idea of like biodegradable things, and it still, you know, might not be the right thing to do, even though technically like, yes, they will like degrade. And I think that this sort of idea of like inclusion is really important, rather than kind of like reprimanding people for like doing things that are wrong, because I think that, yeah, the intention is great. Like most people are out in the outdoors because they want to spend time and enjoy it. And I think that it's a tricky line and something I definitely struggle with on like, how do you quickly communicate something you want to help without, stepping on someone or assuming that you know everything when, I think there's different ways to interact with the outdoors too.
Danny, I think you have a long delay or we cannot hear you.
Oh, no, I was
There
on mute. Sorry.
Now we can hear you.
Sorry.
Now we can hear you.
I thought I toggled it. No, but to kind of just build off of you again. So, to me, ethics versus rules, like in some ways, ethics are an aspirational representation of our societal norms. Whereas, and like, what is the culture that our society wants to cultivate? Whereas rules are a lot more, I think, related to policing. And I don't know if you want to jump into this topic this early in the session. We're half an hour in, but I see you doing that. Yeah, just go for it. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges with any type of guidelines is that really, and not just L&T, but we see this in how backcountry skiing was, or in climbing have been in those communities, the challenges they've encountered with COVID, right? And how communities adapt to rules and what's supposed to happen versus norms and ethics. And the culture of policing is just so toxic, I think, for so many reasons, because particularly for newcomers, it turns people away, and people are going to do something anyway. So when we try to police them, especially if we don't have authority, and almost even worse if we do, we can go down the rabbit hole really quickly of who's being policed by whom, why are they being policed, and is that really the right way to educate? Because I would argue that policing is not any way to educate people, especially if our goal is to share this beautiful outdoor space with people.
Yeah, I think that both of you touched on some really important messages. And I think that policing piece, I've been thinking about this a lot, this week in preparation for this. And I think, it's so important to meet people where they're at. But also that can lead to assumptions where people think that, because this person looks this way, they must not know what they're doing. And that's a dangerous line because, unless you actually, like helpful advice is only helpful if the person doesn't know what they're doing. And it's hard to determine that by like seeing people on the trail for a minute or whatever. But so I think that, it's important to note that, it's not a good thing to make assumptions about people. I think that it's a good way to, really turn people off. And, it's that policing thing that both of you mentioned. Meeting people where they're at means, just having compassion and, instead of policing, explaining and educating, but in a, in a manner that engages them, not where you're not just telling them what they should be doing.
Sirena, I was going to ask, I think you wear many different hats in the outdoor world, and I would love to hear, like, how does that change kind of like your interaction when you're wearing like a guiding hat or just like a pure recreational hat or, like a leadership hat? Like, do you find that the way you're communicating and like helping to portray these ethics like changes in those roles, or does it kind of like stem from the same place in most of your time?
So I actually had a big problem with this when I first started guiding, and I would do stuff that was not guiding, and I was just out for myself, and you know, being that, like, reminding myself that, number one, I'm not the LNT police, you know, like that job that I do it because people are there because they need to know to take care of the place. And also, it's not my job when I'm, you know, it's not my job to police everybody when I'm not working. And so that's a really important thing, but also to be able to, you know, kind of pick and choose. If somebody's doing something that's really egregious, you know, how can you approach that person? Whereas, you know, it's a kind of in the moment picking and choosing whether or not I'm going to respond to things. And a lot of that has to do with context in the moment.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's also as a person who is a, you know, a recreationist, and you consider yourself, you know, responsible or trying to explore in that way, some days you just don't have the bandwidth. Like, I know I've dealt with this. Like, it's, you know, sometimes I feel guilty. Like, I literally saw someone not picking up their dog poop, and I just didn't have it in me that day, that moment. Like, I just didn't, because even if you approach the situation, you know, if there's an opportunity for a learning moment together, and you even apply or are used to utilizing the authority of the resource, which is what the Leave No Trace Center kind of teaches us to do. So we approach people not saying like, I know more than you, but let's find a common ground. We both care about this land, and this land gets damaged by this kind of behavior and that kind of stuff. That's in a nutshell. But even if you have that, it's really hard to approach things and not have this conversation. Like, I feel like every time I have to approach someone for a moment of sharing, I don't know about you guys, but I just get like all sorts of mixed feelings of anxiety, and it's, yeah. Share with me, what's your in on that?
I'm kind of going back to this idea of how we share the principles, or how do we share an educational approach. And, you know, one of the questions I have written down for myself is, you know, are ethics and are rules meant for insiders, right? To me, and this is, I'd love to riff on this if we can for a second, because to me, ethics imply that you're part of a club, right? Like, you know ethics if you are studying something, or you're in a space because you've spent the time, money, effort, influence to make yourself be a part of that space. And I think rules I perceive as very much coming from an external authority. And I wonder if, you know, how does everyone here interact with this idea of ethics versus rules as something that's meant for insiders or not? Because, you know, when I think about how can we share these very wonderful ideas that are yes, Desert Institute says, if you know the ethics, you are part of it, right? But the question to me is like, what if you don't know, right? We're seeing, per the description of this event, astronomical, wonderful, huge amounts of people coming into the outdoors, which is great. Like, this is what I live for. I think this is what all of us here live for, right? To be sharing these beautiful spaces, so that other people can have these wonderful experiences. But what happens when you don't know?
I think this is something that I'm new to thinking about in a lot of ways, and that I've never really like questioned who sets those ethics before, and I've never really like tried to dive into that. And like in the outdoor spaces I am, like, who were the people who decided what was kind of like quote unquote right, wrong, or the proper way to act or the proper way to behave in the outdoors. And I think it's really complicated and it's hard. And I think that, you know, like one of the examples to me is just the idea of being loud and like who decided that like being loud is, you know, disrespectful. And yes, in some ways it like literally does scare off animals, right? Like animals will hear it and like walk away. So you're like maybe ruining someone's experience to like get to look at an animal, but also like being told that you can't like express yourself to the fullest and like see something that just makes you come alive to a point that you have this like emotional reaction is also ruining like someone else's experience. And I think that's where like the outdoors just like gets complicated, and that there aren't like necessarily like easy answers, but there are like better questions that I can be asking myself in these spaces for sure. So sort of, I think still an ongoing process. And I think it's like I'm just starting to get my feet wet in it as well.
So as a trail designer, this is where education at the trailhead and education in the, you know, in the way that you're building your trail and your, you know, what are people seeing when they're coming to the trailhead? Are they, you know, is there a kiosk? Does the kiosk have the 7 principles on it? That can, just that alone can be really helpful as a design feature of your trail system. And then as far as like, I also do a lot of marketing of trail systems, you know, including all of that information in your marketing and, you know, just having that stuff really accessible in a lot of different places, visitor centers, you know, your online materials, chambers of commerce, places that, you know, like that, where people might come into, or visitor centers of small towns, things like that, where people might come into to ask about like, hey, where's there to go to hike here, or where's there to go to, you know, recreate, and just to have that information as many places as possible, and then also working it into the design of the actual trail system.
That's a really great point, and that's something that I do notice a lot, because I'm one of those people that I get to a trail and I like to read everything that's on the board. But I also think there's a lot of people that skip that. So I will agree with you that the more places we can have this posted and shown, the better. And I was thinking back to something that Sophia said about the noise, like who said that we can't be loud. And for me, also, my dad told me I can't be loud because we don't want to scare the animals. But also, and it was mostly about the experience of witnessing the animals, right, in their wild stage. So obviously, when you're loud, even when you're not loud, you'll scare them away because they're so sensitive. So it's on the one end, it's like, oh, if we are quiet, we can all enjoy more of the wildlife in this landscape. But then also, the notion of being loud means different things for different cultures. So, you know, like I'm Mexican, and I would say my culture is kind of loud, just naturally. Like we are naturally loud. So for me to go into
Eso,
sí, sí, sí. So for me to go into like a trail and not be loud, I actually cannot. I don't think about not being loud. I have to think about being really stealthy, because otherwise it doesn't translate for me. So that's, you know, and that's where, going back to, you know, the ethics and you know what they mean, and then you're part of it, and there's a curve to becoming part.
you know, that's interesting. It's really interesting that you bring up the sort of like the cultural interpretation of ethics. So I did this project with the Mammoth Lakes Trails and Public Access Foundation, who took some of the California Prop, I think 68 money last year to provide access for all. And what in the outbreak of COVID, they had created a series of social posts that were kind of playing off of, I think this was maybe right before the responsible recreation guidelines came out. And so they had a series of posts that were kind of maybe right around the same period of time. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, check out, is it recreateresponsibly.org, I think, where you can download a toolkit to learn about what all those different kind of evolution of responsible recreation guidelines looks like. In any case, back to L&T. So I had worked with my contacts over there to translate these different, thank you very much, Desert Institute. I was working to translate into Spanish different responsible recreation guidelines. And it's so interesting to me to think about how do we take something in English. Also, full disclosure, I love languages, I love cultural nuance. And I think I've lived in like 4 or 5 different Spanish-speaking countries. And so I have a pretty neutral accent, but being able to move between these different spaces and think about like, what does one word in Spanish mean to one culture versus a different culture? And how do you translate it from English to Spanish? And then add on the layer of, maybe people haven't even seen these guidelines before. And it was such a fun and I think cool exercise to really interpret these guidelines into something that was hopefully a lot more consumer friendly and less punitive. Because kind of like you, Galacha, I also have to think about being stealthy. You can't tell me to be quiet. Like, I don't really know what that means, but I do know what it means to be stealthy.
As an Italian, not only do I have to be stealthy, I have to calm my hands. Scare off all the animals.
Goodbye, birds.
Yeah. Although it's great for mosquito season.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. We actually got a really good question and prompt from Allison in the audience. I want to bring this up. So she says, I've heard the argument that there's always going to be a portion of the population that can only be influenced by punishment. For example, being fined, rather than being motivated by ethics, for example, wanting to be a good actor. Do our esteemed panelists agree with this assumption? And if not, what is a way to influence people who hold this view that some people need to be policed because they won't be good actors otherwise? If yes, and panelists agree, there is always going to be a portion of the population who will only be motivated by punishment, do they think it's possible for people to change and start caring more? How can we try to motivate people to care? And also, thank you for covering this complex topic. No, thank you, Allison, for this question. It's amazing. If anybody wants to jump in, please go for it.
So I was trying to really quickly Google the stats because I too have. I'm sorry. I'm really into facts. I'm not sorry.
Good. Don't be sorry. Google it, please.
Fact checking is important and always from a reputable source. Different panel. So I've also heard this argument, and as a person that studied social movement, geopolitical movements and social change in developing countries, and for a while thought that was actually going to be a career. Understanding how to motivate actors, good and bad, has been part of my education. And so, but that, however, that was over 10 years ago. So I don't know if I could Google that in just a moment, but that does resonate. And I think I'm just going to jump right into it. I think Allison, you are kind of hitting the nail on the head here, right? There are going to be people that can only be like, we can't motivate everyone with wanting to be accepted. That said, and by accepted, I mean be a good actor. And jump in here, Allison, in chat if you have any other context around the phrase actor. But as I remember it, we have good actors and we have bad actors, but there are different kind of what's the right word? Individuals that influence how an outcome will turn out. And so I think the data is something like over 80% of people want to be accepted. So again, needs to be fact checked, but most people do want to be accepted. And I think that's why we use motivational messaging to, like Sirena said, meet people where they are. And, you know, as a marketing strategist, right, like other hat that I wear, you know, part of meeting people where they are is understanding what their hopes, their needs, and their aspirations are, instead of telling them what not to do. And of course, that is the safety net of telling people what not to do. Sure, there's a fine. I don't think that, I'm not proposing, for example, that we remove all fines for littering or remove fines for, well, maybe we should have a fine for leaving human waste where you shouldn't leave it, but that's a different topic. Anyway, but, you know, I think we need to have both.
This made me think of drone usage in national parks. So I go to the Grand Canyon a lot, and I'm on the rim, and you know, a lot of times you see somebody with a drone, right? And like you said, Gabacha, this is like one of those things where it's like, oh, you know, what am I gonna do? Am I gonna take the time and effort? Like, first of all, how close are they to me, right? So, you know, just as this drone, you know, can I see who's flying the drone? You know, are they nearby me? Maybe they'll suggest that, you know, that, hey, did you know that drones are illegal in national parks? And, you know, I guess based on their response, you know what kind of person you're dealing with. You know, and so if they tell you to, you know, if they start swearing at you, you know, they're obviously not into your description of what the rules are. And then, you know, if they escalate, then it's, you know, then that's the time, you know, you can explain to them, you know, I will always take the education first. And also, like I said, sometimes you just don't have the energy. You just don't have the energy or the time, or you're trying to enjoy the sunset yourself. And but you know, I'm thinking back to, you know, a time when, you know, somebody did not, I tried to educate them. They blatantly just ignored me. And then it's time to, you know, let them know what the fine is for drone, you know, using a drone in the park, and the fact that, you know, there could be a ranger real close by, and you know, leave it at that.
Yeah, I love that example because it is just like, it's hard to take that step and have those conversations. And yeah, I think generally we as people are not great with feedback. You know, I think whatever triggers that deep, you know, like insecurity inside our stomachs, that, you know, light us up and want us to make us defensive. But I think that sort of like this idea of policing can really be like reformed. And I think I've started to do more work on the idea of sort of like restorative justice and transformational justice, and kind of building back to the ideas of harm and accountability, and that this is what we're really working around, right? Because there are rules that you can break and it causes no harm, right? Like I can, you know, I think I do this driving all the time. You know, I didn't really come to a full stop at that stop sign at 4 a.m. in the morning and nobody was around. Did I really cause harm? Question. But then also, like, that's why LNT does exist, because our behaviors do affect, and they can really cause harm to the environment, to the landscape, to others. And so then how do we bring in that accountability? And I think it's hard because I think there's sort of like this middle zone of like people who are like pretty bought in, know what they're doing. They're not perfect all the time. They make mistakes, but like generally like abide by like the quote unquote ethics. And then I think there's sort of this bottom group that is a little bit like, not, I don't want to use ignorant because I think it's too strong of a word, but sort of like unconsciously unknowing of sort of like whatever the quote unquote ethics or like the harm that they might cause. And then I think there's like this like group of people above that are like entitled, who know the ethics and know the rules, but feel as if like they are either above them. And I really struggle with that group. Like I think like the group I try to like and enjoy working with is like elevating people and like elevating their voice and like wanting to like bring them into inclusion. And I really struggle with like what do you do around entitlement? And I would love to hear your guys' kind of like part in that.
Right. I mean, I think if I may, just one quick segue, but sort of a digression, is part of the flip side of entitlement is, or what goes hand in hand with entitlement is privilege, right? Like, as a woman of color that is often in the outdoors alone, not all the time, but like I go run up a mountain, or sometimes I go skiing by myself, right? Like, if I see someone doing something that's egregiously harmful, or even just egregious and benign, depending upon who that person is, I may or may not say something. And part of that may be for my own safety and self-preservation. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that sometimes entitlement is very much related to, I think, the privilege of that dominant outdoors narrative of who plays outside and who can exercise privilege, right? Like, if I was up on, there's a mesa nearby where I spend a lot of time here in Southwest Colorado, and it's a place where I can go any day of the week, and well, I don't say any day of the week, probably a big holiday weekend, and see at least one Confederate flag flying from an ATV or something. And when I see people picking up like excessive amounts of firewood, or like, I don't know, shooting guns in the forest, am I going to say something? No, I'm just going to pretend they didn't see me. Can't get involved there, right? So it's like the question of like, when there are people that are entitled and egregiously breaking the rules, like, what do you do? Like, to me, maybe I need to drive away, go call a ranger.
I'm so grateful that you brought that up, because this has been in the back of my mind throughout this question, right? Like, when we are approaching people, do we believe that if, just with authority of the resource and explaining how this ecosystem works, is that going to be enough motivator for them to change? And then Sirena, you said something that I've been doing this without really knowing that I've been doing this, but I do that. I first approach with like, hey, did you know actually, like, our bighorn sheep are very sensitive to dog pee and dogs in general or whatever. And then eventually get more into there may be a ranger around, and if a law enforcement ranger can give you a fine for this much. And I normally like to enhance the fines a little bit extra. Just because, sometimes I'm like, that fine is not going to motivate anyone. So I just always throw like thousands of dollars in fines at people. But, that's obviously, I hope it's no harm. But as a woman of color approaching people, and this is particular to my experience volunteering in Joshua Tree National Park, I'm wearing a volunteer uniform, which for many times people don't realize that it's a volunteer uniform. They see me and they think I'm a ranger, and they'll call me ranger, and I will respond, because why not? It's like, sure, I'm a volunteer ranger. But as a woman of color, I've noticed a great difference between me approaching somebody and the response versus my white passing boyfriend approaching somebody and bringing up some sort of issue. And we also both have different styles of doing it, but I definitely feel like most times I get a lot of resistance. And this is when I am in a group, obviously in some sort of leadership position, in uniform. So I do think about that a lot when I'm on my own, or when I'm not in a group, or if I'm in a group which is mostly BIPOC. I will think about it twice for just my own safety, because if under uniform I can be faced with resistance and even rudeness, then what can happen if not?
Yeah. And
yes, you're now muted.
So that's very important distinction to make. I do a lot of solo backpacking, and context is everything, right? So that's going to determine whether or not I say anything at all. That's going to determine whether or not I even, try and engage somebody on the trail, depending on how I'm feeling or how they make me feel. And so that's a definite, it's a definite layer. It's another layer of dealing with leave no trace and teaching people. And also, I've had it happen just so many times where people look at me. I wear a skirt on the trail and I'm kind of colorful and I wear, leopard print gaiters and, and there, a lot of times like people think I don't know what I'm talking about, if I'm just like out there, and so it's hard, it like you said, it's, you got to pick and choose when you're going to safely engage people. Ah, yes, of course.
And
So I found, like you say, just kind of on a really I hope hopeful note, Sirena, like you say, context is everything. I'd say what goes hand in hand with that is delivery, right? And for the person that is trying to think about, right, like anyone in the audience is thinking about, like, how do I share these principles, right? Like, think about context, think about delivery, and think about like how you present in within that context, right? Like, because I think these different experiences that we're talking about, I mean, we all identify, I think, as women, and 3 of us are women of color, and but for example, like I'm almost a foot taller than you, Sophia, right? So like the way that I say something, like when I don't know, like actually you do have quite an influential personality. So, but like besides, like the way that how you present is really important within that context too. And I think there is a way to be kind and compassionate in the educational, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, there's sometimes also a reason to say like, not today.
For sure. And I think like on the flip side of it, right, like coming from a white background and like having a lot of privilege in my life and, being like a pro athlete and like outdoorsy. And, I definitely like on the flip side, Sirena, like I dress a certain way, right? Like I wear the right clothes, I have the right slang in a lot of ways. It's been funny like climbing because people just come up to me and like start talking like climbing jargon. And I'm like, I literally have no idea what you were saying right now. Like, I'm just wearing a cool hoodie. Like, I don't know what you're saying. But I think like on the flip side of it, of like being like, when I do get called out, like what does my stomach do? Right. And I definitely like get triggered. And just even like starting to like pay attention to my own biases of like when I am out with like different partners and someone speaks up, like whose voice do I listen to more? And I think that it's on like the flip side of like, one, like, yeah, when are you willing to like speak up and like fight for these things? And then on the flip side, like, when can you like admit that you've like messed up and like, how do you like listen and learn from that? And I think that that is a new conversation that has like gained a lot of steam in the past 2 months, even though it is like a very, very old conversation and something that people have been fighting for a long time. So I think that like, to me, it's like, okay, like, why did I just get like so triggered? Like, it's definitely like a visceral reaction, and taking time to like reflect on it too. But it's, I don't know, I think it's like, yeah, getting more people involved and like admitting that it's okay to like mess up as well has been, I think, a learning path for me personally in the mountains, and not, questioning when somebody calls me out on the way that they look and trying to say like, I have authority here because like I am a pro athlete, like I know everything, like,
right.
There's tons to learn.
That is a thing. That is a thing. I mean, I think, unfortunately from the athlete side, there are probably going to be always people that have that like hyper privilege that think that they get to say whatever they want or act however they want. And that I chalk that sometimes up to like, I I'll have to spend time with you, or I just try not to be in this space because it's emotionally draining. But again, like on the flip side, on the like more hopeful note of, when we're going out on trips or, spending time with new people in the backcountry or even in the front country, one of the things I think has been really cool, kind of echoing what you're saying, Soph, is this idea of listening to other people. Some like, whether it's my gut check telling me to like just hear their perspective or hear their story, and like maybe think about how I'm delivering something better, or on the flip side, like maybe someone else is just asking a question. I think there's such value to just like not talking sometimes and listening, right? And if we're really thinking about how do we help cultivate like that growth mindset, right? That educational, that mind for especially new people that are new to the outdoors, to be hungry for more education and information, and just keep that thirst alive, to want to keep exploring and want to keep learning. I don't know if we've talked about this idea of the vacuum of leadership, but there's that idea of like, sometimes if we just stop talking, people will start to educate themselves, and we can just help kind of, if they go off track, we go off track, we kind of just help nudge them in the right direction. And that's something I've even seen you do with Coombs, right? Like with some of the, like what that day we'd gone out and ski mentored. It was amazing. Like you're just such a great teacher, and listening to, seeing how the kids were doing things, and just because people grow into a space that you let them.
Sophia, do you want to construe a little bit about that, like outing that you guys had, mentoring, and what that like learning moment was like?
Yeah, definitely. I volunteer for Coombs Outdoors, which is a nonprofit here in Jackson that helps get our Latinx community out into the outdoors. And I got into it via the ski snow side of it, and Danny got to tag along for a day, which was just so fun. And my girls like still talk about how rad she is. So good work. But yeah, we kind of had a discussion. Yeah, before the panel a little bit around kind of what we were going to talk about. And I shared a little story of the other day going on a hike with my kids, and they were eating lunch, and one of the kids like peeled an orange, and they were like, can I throw this down? Like, can I leave it? And I just like wanted to jump in like super hard and be like, no, absolutely. Like, blah, 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 blah. And instead I just was like, I'm just going to like shut up, like sit back and like see what happens. And another kid was like, good question. Like, I don't know. I mean, it like is biodegradable. And then someone else was like, I wonder how long it takes for it to actually break down. And kind of having this own like learning moment amongst themselves, and like, yeah, like talking back and forth and discussing it and building sort of their own decision, rather than like me stepping in as this authority figure and saying like, no, this is like the clear cut, like black and white rules around this like situation. I thought was like a good learning moment for me. And I think at the end of the day, like, yeah, if they had decided like it was okay to leave, I would have tried to, change their perspective as well. And I probably would have like sneakily picked it up or something. But also being like, like these conversations are a way better learning space for these kids than me like putting my own beliefs and own opinions and own idea of what is quote unquote right into their like actions.
It's really interesting to me. I think also just kind of going on this idea of, these are kids that are what, like 12 to 16 years old, right? Like if you look at adult learning theory, so in the past, when I was working at Nike as in a marketing communications role, my job sat within the change management function. So my role was to basically market change to a gigantic corporation and all of our B2B partners, which is, I'm sure you can imagine, was sometimes a little bit challenging. And so I started learning about adult learning theory and how people that are, have fully developed brains acquire information and retain information. And, like one of the things that was, well, the two things really, really stick out. And one is, what Sirena had said earlier about meeting people where they are. So as I had said, creating messages that speak to people's hopes, wants, needs, aspirations, and hot points. But on the other side of that is really, like what you're saying, Sophia, creating environments in which people can sort of crowdsource and build around an idea rather than being preached to, because that's a really good way for them to like to have an experience. Like I'm sure, well, I don't know if they'll remember this moment, this orange moment, but you will, right? Like as an educator and as a mentor, and I'm sure that someone down the line will have a distinct memory probably years from now when they're off at college or backpacking on their own or with friends, and someone else will ask them, can I leave the orange? And they'll say no. And here's why.
Well, thanks for sharing that story, because I think the orange peel is one that has affected all of us at some point in our lives. But that just gave me a great idea, kind of in the approach, right? Like in that moment, the girl, boy, child that dropped that and had an inquiry about it, right? They were aware of their action, and they thought, well, throwing things on the ground is not right. So is it right if it's a fruit? Is it right if it's a peel, or how that works? So maybe there's something there where it's like, oh, what do you think is going to happen to all of these? Like how long do we think they're going to be here? Because I think, and it also depends on the ecosystem, how fast they will decompose and whatnot. So I think there's definitely something there, and like you can start a conversation off of that and kind of together examine if I think a lot of humans, because we are so bombarded by media and our attention spans are so short these days, we do a lot of things without being conscious of it. So if we can bring that consciousness back, and we can help each other out, right? Like if you see me doing something that just totally didn't make sense, is it really that I didn't know, or is it just that in that moment I wasn't aware? And how can you help me become aware in this moment?
Yeah, I really love the story that you told, Sophia. It's just got a lot of great layers to it. And that idea that that it was so much more impactful than you coming and wagging your finger in their face and being like, yeah, this is what you're supposed to do, and so that's where like that overarching principle again of the grandmother's house comes in, because that's it's not just these 7 rules. It's a whole like mindset, right? And instilling that mindset, and and that makes it easier. Like you don't have to say this principle. It would be like, well, would you leave a bunch of orange peels at on your grandma's floor? So that's where I found it's a great tool to use for people, and again, that layer of respect for the place that you're inhabiting at the moment.
I love, Sirena, this idea of just being able to think about the space that you're inhabiting, right, as kind of like we are beings that move within, many spaces, right? But whether it's your living room or your grandmother's house or your own backyard, you want it to look nice, and you want it to be somewhere you can come back to. Kind of coming back to our original question, but I think I don't say but, and I think again I'd be kind of remiss if we didn't just like one final point on this like policing idea of like how do we deliver information and what's the context. I don't know if anyone saw, but just I think was it this past week or 2 weeks ago, the Sierra Club came out and made a statement around John Muir, right? And there's I think an increasing consciousness. Galatia, you and I talked about this in our interview the other day around like what is the legacy of segregation and removal for Black Americans and Native Americans respectively look like, because particularly when we are sharing information with people that that aren't part of our immediate social group, let's just put it that way, sometimes the context of delivering that information can be even more harmful. without if we are not aware of those ideas. And so there's, gotcha, well, you mentioned the book that you brought up the other day, just as a resource.
Sorry, what was that last part?
The book that you brought up.
Oh, yes. I'm going to write it down here on the chat. It's called Dispossessing the Wilderness. And it kind of, let me see if I'm writing it correctly. Dispossessing the Wilderness. It's a book that walks you through the history of the creation of the National Park Service and how that played a part in the removal of Native Americans. And that's actually, it's a good segue because I did want to look back eventually into this argument or ongoing thing about the eighth principle and tagging responsibly. So it brings me back because I always think I'm thinking about it in terms of geotagging responsibly is that gatekeeping. So why should we tag responsibly? What does that mean? And why is that good? Why is that not good?
So Sophia and I had a really good, long, meaty conversation about this a couple of weeks ago, and we were out on a big hike together. And I think we chatted for at least half an hour about it, right? So, do you have any highlights that you can share with us before I get on the soapbox?
Oh man, I think that this again has been like a learning experience for me because I definitely used tag responsibly Jackson Hole, and I had a friend be like, hey, like consider why you're using this tag and like who you're excluding and not giving information to. And it led me down definitely a path of considering like who has been my mentor, like why do people give me information, who withholds information. I think I see also with a lot of people who aren't on social media at all. And they're like, if you don't want to give this information, why are you posting on social media? Like, who cares about a tag, right? But also they come from a even more stingy generation around gatekeeping. And so I think I would love to hear maybe different perspectives around the overcrowding side, because I feel definitely less educated and more triggered around that. And I've sort of myself processed more of the safety side of, giving people locations in which they're not prepared for either like the elements or whatever they face in that situation. And I think that, again, like learning to ask different questions has been really helpful. And I guess the question that I've kind of like stumbled upon is like, why do I value protecting kind of eager white men from getting hurt over the inclusion of other people? And I think that is the question I come back to often in sort of asking this, because I am terrified that if I give away a location and someone kills themselves, I'll feel terrible. And then I often question, will that even happen? And again, like, why am I biased to really caring about one population over the experience of another? And when I frame it that way, then I can like begin to have that discussion. Is sort of where I've stumbled upon, but of course would love to hear sort of other people's explanation, because I know we're a little bit limited on time.
Can I jump in here, and then I can tell Sirena wants to say something. Just really quick, I want the audience to remember that Sophia is speaking specifically from the, and tell me if I'm speaking for you, but I understand that you're speaking from the perspective of, as a skier, a backcountry skier who's skiing highly technical, high altitude, high risk, high risk of death, like kinds of things. And right, yes, deaths. We're not talking about like Hanging Lake or like a front country attraction, right? So I think there's an important distinction between front country and backcountry. Actually, I don't say distinction. I think there's a nuance in what geotagging is, right? And like for me, like I often like have thought about it coming up as an athlete and just recreationist, as a person that was fearful of being like in the climbing world. We talk a lot about spray queens or spray king, and I was definitely kind of put into the place of like it would be bad. Like Georgie Abel, who's a writer and a climber, has a really interesting article if anyone climbs out there on spray queens, on like why a woman is not allowed to talk about a specific rock climb, but of course a man can, right? And so like I coming up in the climbing world, and like not coming up, but like just as I started to learn more and more about climbing, I was always very hesitant to speak about like any of my achievements or things I'd done, because I was afraid I would be like labeled as such, and I didn't want to be labeled as such. And I think like for me, like this is, you know, I've traveled all over the Western, actually, well, I've also gone to the East Coast, but, you know, all over the Western US and in South America to climb and ski, unsponsored and self-funded, just noting. But you know, it's like, it's complicated. And I think now, like one of my takeaways from our conversation, Sophia, was this idea of, I think, sharing the idea and sharing the stoke is never a bad way to get other people inspired. And then like in general, like especially when I'm doing more technical or cooler things, because there aren't that many women of color that like post online about, I don't know, running across a mountain range or skiing some technical line. So I will start geotagging more. And I have been, but you know, I also think that there's another argument or layer to overuse. So I'm just speaking from the backcountry perspective, but I think the other question that's like, it's a bigger question, is how do we geotag, or what is geotagging for front country? And that one is so complex. Serena, do you have thoughts here?
I have a bunch of thoughts. And I'm coming from this as I've had a blog since, here, can you hear me? Okay. So I've had a blog since 2009, where I've shared my experiences and journeys and hikes. And, you know, some of these are technical, off trail, you know, burly sorts of things. I've always come at it, I guess it's the same as most of the rest of my life. I've always come at it from an educational standpoint. So rather than just tagging something, I'm going to tell you like more information, rather than just, hey, this is where this is a pretty place. Like I always want to give that extra layer of information, that also, you know, that carries over, because for the last 2 years, I've been working on this guidebook on the best day hikes on the Arizona National Scenic Trail. And so, you know, I'm obviously going to bring a lot more people to the Arizona Trail as a result. And how do you do that so that those people are well prepared? And, you know, for example, my book it's for beginners. It's for, you know, it's written for beginners. You know, the trail is 800 miles, but it's 30 hikes of different lengths. And one of the things in the book is, you know, I definitely have the leave no trace principles. I have a desert hiking guide, things like that. But giving people that information and equipping them with the education that they need to go out there safely has always been my angle on things. And I know that it's going to bring a lot more people. And, you know, I've written about, you know, places all over Arizona, mostly, but, you know, in some places that are gems that, you know, I've gotten some feedback from, like, hey, why did you write about that? And it's like, well, the reason is because I learned about it because somebody else wrote about it. You know, I found out about it from somebody else. And, you know, I just want people to, like I said, it's that education piece. So instead of just saying, hey, this is where this is, educating them and, hey, you know, this is this place, you need a permit. This is how you get the permits. You know, you can't just show up. you know, these are the rules when you get there, you know, those sorts of things, and weaving those sorts of things in with the stories that I tell has always been my perspective.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Serena. And I think in my personal experience with the whole geotagging responsibly, I think I got very excited about it at first, and I thought, yes, of course, we're not supposed to tag. But then I thought about it. It's like, I mean, if I really wanted to go to a place, I could do a like reverse image search, for example. I'll eventually get to it. Like if I really wanted to go. That being said, not everybody knows how to do that, and not everybody can access it as easily. So I think we've found more and more that there are places that are gems, and that, you know, ultimately, if we provide that information with good context, like Serena does, I think that has a good impact, and it has it makes it more inclusive. The only thing I wanted to. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, because I know. Yeah, okay. We're going into the last minute, but the only time, there's only been one place that I've visited where the native people asked me to not write about it, especially when I was traveling and I was doing travel writing and adventure writing. You know, I discovered this amazing place. And the people from there, they asked me, they said, we only get 10,000 visitors a year, and we are really okay with that. And we cannot handle more. So we will appreciate it if you only tell and basically he gave me like parameters. Like if it's someone who's into meditation and yoga, you can tell them about us and they can come visit, because they care so much. And these are people that grew up selling their family's artifacts to dealers for money for candy. You know, these are kids that used to steal from their native treasures to get candy because they didn't know, and they grew up to develop this beautiful space for them and for their visitors, but they cannot handle, and they don't want growth, and they don't want that. So obviously I think that was for me, it's like, yes, I have to honor that, you know. But otherwise, I think if it's a free country and if it's an open public land, then it is.
I kind of just, I'm hoping that there's like one of the things I had seen, an online friend named Wild Gina, if anyone knows this person. Great. She's a former ESPN producer, great Instagram. But yeah, she had posted something today about, you know, the responsibility, right? And I think
yes,
if we're circling back to what is Leave No Trace and what is maybe like one common theme that I take away from these principles, is that we each have a personal responsibility to not just care for this land and care for the communities that host them, and to this broader world and all the creatures it hosts. I think we also have a responsibility to think about, what do our actions mean when we are in a digital space, right? Like, to post something with zero context and can be dangerous, whether it's in the backcountry or in the front country. And so maybe my proposal is just that, you know, I think we should think about, like, what is it that we're doing and why? And if it, you know, is it to gain some sort of recognition? Is it to share an experience? Like, what is the point of putting it on social media, right? Like, yes, let's get more people outside, but let's also help educate people, because people can't protect something that they don't love, and they can't love it if they don't know it. And the only way they can know it is if we bring them there. But we also, as people that have maybe more experiences in these spaces, have a responsibility to pass this information on. I'm done.
That's such an important thing, because, you know, we're going to need stewards for the next generations, and that's how you get them, is you show them the outdoors, and you have them they have these experiences that stick with them, and they understand why this is an important resource and an important, and I say resource, but there's so many layers to that, right? So
thank you so much. So I just want to close with, I think I open asking why you leave no trace. So I want to close. I want to close with asking you guys, why should everybody leave no trace?
I guess I'll maybe just jump in the same order here. Sorry, I'm taking place in wow, this is a hard question, I think, but I think it's because like when we work together, like we can really like make something special. And I think that everybody should be bigger and broader than I think the even just natural assumption of who are people who buy into the leave no trace principles. But I think it's because together, like we can always make something more special.
I like that. I can't wait to adventure again with you. I think we should all be thinking about leave no trace because we should be imagining ourselves and the family that will come from us, right? Like the future generations, whether it's our children and grandchildren or our nieces and nephews and their children, and what kind of world do we want to create for them?
yeah, my answer is very similar to Danny's. It's stewardship and respect for the land to leave it for generations to come.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to echo everything you just said because that was perfect. I love it. We work together, we make things more beautiful and more special because we are not alone or the last ones to be standing in this world. So we have to watch out for our own future, even if we're not going to be here for it in this form. So thank you so much, ladies, for joining me tonight. This has been a wonderful conversation. I've been enjoying your company all of these days. I'm going to have withdrawals, I feel like. So let's get together some other time. Thank you, audience members. Thank you for your question, Allison. That was an incredible question. I hope we addressed it and that you felt like we kind of answered it. I feel very hopeful. And I want to thank again the Desert Institute and the Joshua Tree National Park Association for having us. I'm going to drop some links in the chat for different ways in which you can support us. If you already donated, we really appreciate it. If you cannot donate today, but maybe in the future you can, I will appreciate if you can keep us in the back of your mind and come back and donate or participate in some of the field classes, which are actually starting in September with very strict COVID-safe guidelines. So if you go to the joshuatree.org website, you'll be able to find out all about the different classes that are going to happen in Joshua Tree National Park this fall, and hoping that they do happen. They have managed to reduce the class sizes without raising the prices, so keeping them pretty accessible. These classes are life-changing. I don't just say that because I volunteer for many of them. They really are. It's opened the door for me whenever I go to another park to figure out where's the Field Institute and can I get on one of those classes, because you just get a total different perspective and experience of the park. So I highly recommend it. Again, thank you so much for this time together. I'm Gabacha, your Desert Life host, and I hope to see you soon.